Hello, this is Adam Carroll with Justice for All, UN Program Director. Welcome to UN This Week. And this week is the week of the anniversary of the traumatic 9/11 terror attack on the United States. Here in New York, today's blue skies are very reminiscent of that September day, though with a bit of global warming thrown in. But also, we mark the United Nations International Day of Charity. So it seemed appropriate to combine the two to examine the intersection of charities and national security law. The attacks on the United States on September 11th, 2001, ushered in an era of expansive terrorism, counterterrorism laws and policies impacting the funding, planning, and delivery of humanitarian assistance and protection to people in need. Today's guest, Kay Guinane, Director of the Charity and Security Network, coordinates efforts to make national security rules impacting the work of civil society more compliant with the Constitution and eliminate unnecessary barriers to legitimate work of nonprofits. In this role for the last 10 years, she has published research, testified before Congress, and engaged extensively in advocacy and consulting on these issues in the US and abroad. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I see on your website that your work has addressed webinars on banking relationships and the closure of nonprofit bank accounts, know your rights information about sanctions. Your organization has authored reports on safeguarding humanitarian actions in situations of armed conflict and in disaster. There's been litigation and consulting with NGOs and grant makers. And recent successes that are mentioned on the website include the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act of 2018. And the many challenges include, unfortunately, anti-Muslim lawyers who have been targeting humanitarian programs assisting Palestinians. Our NGO works mainly on behalf of persecuted Muslim minorities such as the Uyghur and the Rohingya of Burma. I note that just a day or two ago, the US put sanctions on the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Ms. Bensouda, because she refuses to rule out investigating the US for war crimes in Afghanistan and other reasons as well. If a nonprofit such as ours wanted to have Ms. Bensouda as part of a Zoom conversation, this is a little different than your main focus, but would we be in trouble?
That's a very good question, and it is one typical of the kind of questions and challenges that face charities when they're trying to deliver services, when they're trying to make the public aware of what's going on in conflict areas or with refugee populations and other issues around the world, and when they're trying to advocate for change or for policies that would promote human rights and humanitarian assistance and democracy building. So what you... say the hypothetical you raise is very typical because it involves a very gray area of the law, which is free speech. And at what point are you going beyond free speech and supporting someone who's subject to US sanctions? And sanctions laws vary. Different bills passed by Congress or different executive orders signed by presidents define the terms around many sanctions, but many of them use very vague terms to describe what kind of transactions are prohibited with a sanctions person. And is having someone as a guest on your show, giving them a platform to explain their views or promote their cause, is that material support? Is that going beyond just free speech? Not a clearly settled question in the law.
It's interesting. And by the way, we're having some sound difficulties again, but we'll hopefully be able to get through them. But if I speak over you, that's why. So I was just wondering what prompted you to get involved in this? Where, how, and why did you? Are you part of the Charity and Security Network?
Well, at the time of 9/11, I was working in DC for a government watchdog organization, and my job was to protect and promote the rights of nonprofit organizations to speak freely on public issues and to assemble and take action together. And after 9/11, of course, the Patriot Act and the executive orders started to put serious limits on those rights. And over time, we attempted all during the George W. Bush years to respond to that and to push back against it with limited success. But when President Obama came into office, we saw here's an opportunity. If the U.S. nonprofit sector could come together, all of our diverse parts that are affected by these problematic laws, come together and speak with one voice to the new administration and propose practical fixes that are consistent with security interests and constitutional and human rights standards, that we could fix this problem. That was what we thought. So we formed the Charity and Security Network after Obama was elected for that purpose. At that time, we thought this would be a 3-year effort. The new president is the son of an international aid worker, and he'll get it, and we'll be able to put this together and eliminate these problems. Unfortunately, that's not how it worked out. We did form the Charity and Security Network. We put together these proposals. We've done ongoing advocacy and education on these issues and made policy gains that protect the sector much better than it was protected during the George W. Bush administration. But for the most part, the laws themselves have not changed. The problematic legal framework remains, and that is something we continue to work towards changing in the long run.
You know, I do remember being part of some listservs at that time, being aware of you forming this, and I know David Cole and others were in the room or involved in conversations around this subject, and there were a lot of civil liberties groups in discussion, in partnership, and it's great so that you actually are a network.
Yeah.
So how does it function as a network?
We have an advisory board that represents key stakeholders affected by these issues. So there are a number of Muslim charities, humanitarian organizations, civil liberties groups like Defending Rights and Dissent and the ACLU, grant makers, so the Council on Foundations, the Alliance for Peace Building, and other peace building groups, and some experts on humanitarian law. And that advisory group of 19 people set forth priorities and goals every year that we then work together on. So we have a staff of 3 people, and our membership, we have about 500 members of civil society, both in the United States and around the globe, that work together on these issues. You know, this fits in to a larger issue of closing civil society space. That is something that is happening globally, and this is the U.S. version. And unfortunately, the U.S. had some of the most restrictive laws, security laws that apply to charities, at least within the Western world. And because of the influence of the U.S. banking system and U.S. law, it has a lot of problematic impact on people and organizations outside the U.S. as well as inside the U.S.
Well, maybe speaking of that, we could take a look again at that same website page and go to the map. That might be a good way to, so that fourth box on the right.
There's our homepage, and then we have an interactive map that will come up that shows countries in the world where U.S. counterterrorism restrictions have an impact, either because the country is sanctioned or because there are non-state armed groups that are present and active that are sanctioned. So you see, for example, Venezuela in South America is marked there. And then in Africa and the MENA region in Central Asia, there are also countries that are noted. And then if you click on one, for example, Somalia, that page comes up and it will give you background on humanitarian need in the country, but also who are the designated or terrorist listed non-state armed groups in the country and what laws apply. And then what procedures are needed for humanitarian or other organizations that would like to get assistance into territories that are controlled by al-Shabaab. Basically, al-Shabaab has been listed as a terrorist group by executive order. Under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is a sanctions law. And the executive order bars anyone from having transactions with them or providing support, not just money and weapons and that kind of thing, but also material support. And the definition, of course, of material support of terrorism is very vague. In Somalia, this had tragic consequences in the famine in 2011, when many people suffering in the famine were in al-Shabaab controlled areas. And one of the problems with U.S. policy is it doesn't, and U.S. law, doesn't distinguish clearly between civilians that are living under the control of a designated terrorist group and the group itself. And it treated all the people living inside al-Shabaab controlled territories as if they're al-Shabaab fighters, which is clearly not the case, especially with children. And a UN report that followed the famine showed that legal restrictions were a contributing factor to an unusually high death rate in that famine. So that one of the key examples of why the US legal framework needs to be changed to make clear distinctions between civilians and combatants, and to make implementation of our counterterrorism regime consistent with our national obligations under the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law, as well as our Constitution.
15 years ago, during the Bush years, I recall when bank accounts were being frozen or shut down of some charities. And there was a real lack of information being shared with nonprofits, with charities. And this, your project certainly provides more clarity and perhaps space for dialogue with government as far as that's possible. And it seems that, 15 years ago, a big fear and focus was that these kind of knee-jerk reactions by the government, treating nonprofits as a potential source of terrorism financing, was driving away donors. and that a lot of nonprofits were suffering, and people weren't giving for a while. I think we've come through that, and now, of course, the challenge is COVID-19 impacting fundraising. But as far as the fear and the reality that donors are being driven away, do you still hear that as a concern?
Not as much as we did, for example, as you cite, during the Bush years, when that was a serious problem. After Obama became president, they, rather than change the law, they just changed the enforcement policy, and there was no longer the kind of discriminatory, targeted enforcement towards Muslim charities that had been going on under the Bush administration. For example, the Obama administration did not shut down any charities or freeze assets. I think that was in part because the problem of charities financing terrorism is a non-problem. It's not an issue that required action, because as Treasury has since come to acknowledge, the nonprofit sector overall is low risk of terrorist financing, and even the organizations that work in places like Somalia take steps to mitigate the risk that their assets would be diverted to terrorist organizations. So under the Obama administration, there was more space, giving started to resume. But what we have seen is that banks who are fearful of enforcement for sanctions violation will often block transfers across borders, or will close bank accounts without explanation based on, well, we don't know what they're based on. They don't have to give reasons, and there's no legal recourse for this. In our dialogue with banks, we understand they say it's fear of sanctions enforcement and the vagueness in the law that makes it possible for bank examiners to come in and say, well, the nonprofits are high risk, even though the Treasury Department has said no, nonprofit sector is low risk. So that's the problem. There's still a problem with getting funds through, but individual donors to charities should be able to feel a great deal of comfort in giving to a group that's an organization. You can check and make sure that an organization is registered. If it's an American organization, it would be incorporated at the state level. If it's tax exempt, it will have filings made public by the IRS. And so there are plenty of ways to give. The problem now is getting the money through to where it's needed.
Well, in a place like northern Syria, where, things have changed on the ground, but there are large areas which are controlled either by government, such as it is in Syria, or controlled by various armed groups, some of which we designate as terrorists, some of which, though, we as a government have worked with. Then there's the government of Turkey, which calls the Kurdish groups terrorists, while we've treated them as allies and until we kind of betrayed them last year. And so all this shifting mess means that hundreds of thousands of Syrian men, women, and children are suffering and often have no access to medical care or food. And so even now, I mean, I think that the world has stopped paying a lot of attention to Syria, which is awful to say. But how about the way these laws, these counterterrorism laws, impact humanitarian assistance in Syria? Has that been an issue?
They certainly complicate it and make it much more difficult to get aid in and slow things down much more than should be the case. In Syria, as you noted, it's both the government of Syria is sanctioned And then there are many non-state armed groups operating in Syria that are on the terrorist list. So it's a very complicated environment for an NGO to be working in, and depending on whether or not, for example, they need where they're located and who's controlling the territory where they're located, they may need to negotiate access to the civilian population. They may need to get past a toll booth on the road, or get a permit, or purchase electricity from a local utility. If any of those, that infrastructure is owned or controlled by a listed group or the Syrian government, there could be limits on what the nonprofit could do. We've seen there is a process that's supposed to be the escape valve for humanitarian assistance in Syria and elsewhere, which is to get a license from Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, which would allow otherwise prohibited activities. The problem is there's a general license for Syria, which means you're not supposed to even have to apply. It's just a statement of what's permissible for any American person or organization to do in Syria. But the way that it's interpreted is very narrow. It creates great difficulties. And then the Commerce Department also has import-export licenses. So if you want to move protective medical equipment, say during the COVID crisis, to Syria, you could have problems getting a license from the Commerce Department, or at least it would take a lot of time to do that. So the system has become so wrapped up in red tape that it eats up a lot of time and resources for charities to get the licenses that they need, or to get clear authorization. Then hopefully they're able to start to move their resources to help people in Syria. Then they run in, if they're trying to move money, they run into problems with the banks, which may not want to transfer the funds because they are also concerned about all these rules. So this whole system is become so complicated and bureaucratic that it really is a serious problem, especially in a place like Syria, and right now with access to medical equipment, medical services, especially since so many of the hospitals in Syria have been bombed by Russian-backed forces.
It's awful. I wondered also, about the Trump administration. One might expect with some of the xenophobic or Islamophobic members of the administration that policies would worsen. Have you seen that?
In some cases, yes, and in others, not. It's a mixed record. Fortunately, there are a lot of dedicated career civil servants in the federal agencies who continued in their jobs and continue to do their jobs properly. And that's limited the amount of political activity or politicized measures that might otherwise have been taken. That doesn't mean that's not a problem. For example, the USAID's Office of Inspector General has taken a very zero tolerance approach to interpreting these rules and restrictions. So, and when they do investigations for fraud, or when there are complaints about a nonprofit, they will look at any vagueness in the law where you're trying to figure out whether an activity is legal or not, and the law doesn't clearly tell you, or any small mistake gets made, they will go after that as if it were major fraud, but basically not distinguishing between minor technical violations and major fraud. So that's been a problem.
How about USAID? I mean, not USAID, but all the agencies in their treatment of Palestine, because certainly even at the UN, the U.S. refuses now to fund any aid going to Palestine. Is that correct?
Pretty much so. And it's always, U.S. law has always been more restrictive in Palestine than other places. There is what's known as Mission Order 21 applies in Gaza that basically bans any contact with the Hamas government pretty much for any purpose. So we have had members tell us they wanted to provide supplies and assistance for school children. They couldn't go into the school and cooperate with the school to do that because the school's part of the Ministry of Education, which is part of the Hamas-controlled government. And they were handing out school supplies from the trunk of a car instead. That's the kind of overly restrictive and troubling consequence of the U.S. policy in Gaza. We've also seen private actors now. There are some extreme Zionist organizations that are trying to use the vagueness in the law against nonprofits that work in Gaza, saying that they're providing material support to terrorism and filing lawsuits in federal courts under the whistleblower statute, the False Claims Act, claiming that organizations like the Carter Center, they claim that the Carter Center provided material support to terrorism because they held a conflict resolution meeting at their office in the West Bank where they had all the Palestinian factions there, which included two listed organizations, Hamas and the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. And there was they served water, fruit, and cookies. And the Zionist Advocacy Center filed a lawsuit asking for $90 million in damages because of this, claiming that this was material support of terrorism. Fortunately, the Justice Department had good sense in this case and made a motion to dismiss, saying that these lawsuits are not the place to settle political debates about Middle East peace or peace between Israel and Palestine. But
that would be expensive cookies. My goodness. Well, I think we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and just speak briefly about the UN, its involvement in these issues, and also perhaps what we can do, what people can learn about and get educated about, so that perhaps if there's change in Washington, we can move things forward and make them less onerous. So we'll be right back. This is UN This Week.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe, and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
It's Adam's World. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah. Let's explore.
Assalamu alaikum.
I love Adam's World because it makes me learn in a fun way. That Adam has a green face and orange hair. I like this song. I like how Adam sings. I like Adam's World because it makes me happy. What? No. Here's Adam and here's Anissa. Adam is and his sister. Adam is a boy and he is very smart.
Download the new Adam's World app at adamsworldapp.com and let's help tomorrow's Muslims today.
And this is Adam Carroll with Justice for All, UN This Week, and with our guest today, Guinane, Director of Charity and Securities Network, talking about the impact of counterterrorism law and policy on nonprofits. So we were talking about some of the countries that have problems now with receiving humanitarian aid because of all these bureaucratic, sometimes very reactionary rules. And certainly high up on that was Palestine. I'm sure, though, that there are many other areas. Is Pakistan or any of the South Asian countries also in the same boat, more or less?
More or less, yes. Anywhere where there is a non-state armed group that is on the U.S. terrorist list or the country itself is designated, you will see these problems. It spills across borders. So the one major area is the Sahel portion of Africa. It includes northern Nigeria, Niger, parts of Mali, where Boko Haram is active. So, and the way that these laws, it's a combination of, for NGOs on the ground, a combination of the restrictions that they have to deal with from the US law perspective, but also what the Nigerian government is doing. And you have occasions where the actions of the military in Nigeria just makes things worse. So that's one example of how these laws can be interpreted to the most extreme level. We've all read and heard about several years ago where a number of Nigerian schoolgirls were kidnapped by Boko Haram. USAID now has a rule that's been in place for a little while that prohibits their grantees from providing assistance to someone who's been in the custody of a listed group for 6 months or more without clearance from their agreement officer. So these schoolgirls, they were kidnapped if they're held more than 6 months, or if they're raped and bear children, their babies become more than 6 months old, NGOs theoretically can't help them without getting clearance first on the individual case from USAID. And we think that this is a clear violation of international humanitarian law, but it's gone unaddressed.
At the United Nations, there are many agencies. I know we've been looking at a few of the reports that Charity and Securities Network has produced on our screen just a moment ago. And those dealt with different conflict situations, but there's also disaster situations where one has to provide help quite urgently, and yet these laws and policies get in the way. But as far as the United Nations goes, I think we have a link that maybe we can put up on the screen from Pass Blue. And it just refers to a recent story about the counterterrorism programs at the UN that, in fact, are largely funded by the Saudis and Qataris, but of course, who are rivals. And the UAE is in there too. And so it becomes very politicized. And certainly reading this article, I became very concerned about a lack of transparency in the UN counterterrorism world. And so I was wondering about counterterrorism laws in UN agencies. how are they impacted in this era of of heightened concern about security issues?
Like with U.S. law, there's been an enormous impact because UN Security Council resolutions are binding on all member states. So after 9/11, the UN the Security Council passed resolutions imposing sanctions on Al-Qaeda, and subsequently on other terrorist organizations, and on the financing of terrorism, but also on assistance. And in many cases, the humanitarian exemptions in these programs are, I would say, weak at the very best, and at least not sufficient for organizations to get the aid in that's needed in the areas where these listed groups operate. There was last year, the UN Security Council passed a new resolution, 2462, that consolidated the counterterrorism sanctions programs under one umbrella, and they included language that countries, it's binding, countries must take action to criminalize support for terrorism and take action to stop terrorist financing. But they said in several places that this action must be consistent with the country's legal obligations under international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law. Now, that's something that we can use going forward to say there should not be an exemption, or there should be an exemption for every sanctions program, or there should be clear guidance to countries on what they need to do to make sure humanitarian aid can flow unimpeded and in a manner consistent with the Geneva Conventions and the protocols that go with it. So that's an opportunity for civil society to push that forward. The resolution passed in March 2019, and the one-year implementation report came out this summer, and it's very clear that most countries have no system in place to check and make sure that their systems are compliant or complementary with humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law. So that's a task for us as civil society to make sure that all countries, including the United States, take steps to make sure that that our laws are compliant and they're enforced in a way that allows humanitarian access to civilians in need.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of any resolutions or activities at the UN to push these issues further? I guess that I'm dimly aware of some exceptions being made for Somalia in the Security Council at one point. But there's so many conflicts and so many disasters around the world currently. So you're speaking about standardizing the rules, and that so far countries are not complying really. And when countries can politicize what terrorism is for political gain, what is their incentive to do the right thing?
Wow, their incentive to do the right thing, that's a tough one. It has to be, I think, in the end, public pressure. They will respond to what their citizenry demands of them. And that means all of us, and here in the United States, especially, we may have a new administration or a second term of the Trump administration. We will have a new Congress in January. So no matter what happens in the election, it's incumbent upon us to insist that our country's counterterrorism framework be brought up to date. Stop playing whack-a-mole with ineffective measures that we've done for the last 20 years, and respect our obligations under international humanitarian, human rights, and refugee law.
So with Congress, we're hoping, since I think you have a background in Kentucky, that you'll be helping us with Mitch McConnell. but as far as, I mean, this conversation obviously is not about shielding lawbreakers, or rather shielding terrorists. But the policy seems to be right now throwing the baby out with the bathwater, or really making much more of an impact, negative impact on a sector that could help prevent terrorism by providing needed services, providing education, providing nonviolent training and peacemaking, all those alternatives to war, and that those are disallowed under the current approach. So just as far as what viewers might want to do, whether going to your website or just thinking about how they can feel comfortable giving and supporting their favorite charities. We want people to be giving to help the Rohingya and help the refugees, help the people in Kashmir, what have you. And so how can community members feel confidence? How can nonprofit leaders feel support?
I think, well, there are several forms of support. Of course, financial support for organizations that are providing assistance or advocating for the rights of civil society to provide this kind of assistance and to play its role in helping to reduce conflict and address drivers of conflict around the world. All that is extremely important. It helps us keep doing our work day to day. But also, I think bringing this issue up with your members of Congress, perhaps with organizations you're already part of, religious congregations, statewide or local community organizations that may be concerned about an issue, because just about any issue you deal with has an international program that related to that issue, for whether it be environmental, anti-corruption, building peace, stopping hunger, educating kids, providing medical services. All those things are having difficulties operating across borders because of these rules. So raising it and getting people to stop, take a few minutes and learn about it, and then raise these issues with decision makers, all that's very, very helpful.
So I know on your website there's a lot of material. We started looking at it, but here's one more. Actually, this is just about the Humanitarian Law Project decision 10 years ago, and your webinar is talking about its impact over the last 10 years. And that's quite interesting issue, which we don't have much time for. But there are a number of webinars as we're all doing more work online. So I think that there's great resources on your website. Also, I wanted to post a report from the UN. It's the OCHA report that talks about the impact of donor counterterrorism measures on principled humanitarian action. And they have 7 different recommendations, which you can read about. But I think that, it's very aligned with your organization. Since this is a UN-oriented show, I wanted to mention this. We'll be putting the link into the chat and comment sections. So it's something to really become more educated about, and I hope the community will think about how we can strengthen the nonprofit sector so that, we see the trend globally is that authoritarian governments are really giving civil society a hard time. And we can't really have democracy, and we can't really have charities without a strong civil society sector, whether it's religious-based, whether it's Red Cross or a small charity that some people put together in the neighborhood. This is a sacred impulse, sacred human impulse to give and to give back. So I really appreciate, Kay, that your organization is working to protect this impulse in this complicated world that we live in now. So any last words you would like to say before we sign off the show today?
I just thank you and all the listeners for your attention to this issue. It appears sometimes to be kind of a technical, bureaucratic issue, but it really goes to our most basic fundamental values of respecting life and our environment and treating each other well. So I appreciate your time and giving us this opportunity.
Thank you very much. So thank you, everybody. Know your rights, and if you don't use them, you might lose them. So please remember, and we'll see you next show Thursday. So thank you, everybody. UN This Week.